Hello and welcome back to Rockschool. No, we haven't lost Alistair and reverted to a three-piece. We were just trying to demonstrate the fact that synthesizers are no longer the exclusive property of keyboard players. Because of the advent of digital technology and MIDI, we can all have a go. So, in that first piece, I was playing a bass line off the electronic pads, Henry was playing a bass guitar synthesizer, and Deirdre, I think, was probably playing Mozart on a guitar synthesizer.
Now, it wasn't until the mid-1970s that the first guitar synthesizers began to emerge, and even then there were still problems. Guitarists obviously wanted polyphonic synthesis so they could play chords, and most of the earlier models were monophonic. There also was a stumbling block around the design and playability of the guitar as compared to a keyboard.
The keys on a standard synth are really little more than switches, so creating a note is a pretty straightforward process. You press a key, and immediately the internal circuitry in the synth knows what note it is, how long it was played, and how hard it was played.
Compare that to how a guitar is played. Guitar and bass strings are picked, bent, slapped, strummed, and dampened, often in rapid succession. You also get harmonics, overtones, and sympathetic resonances. How can you transfer all this into a signal that a synthesizer understands?
The instruments we have here represent the best attempts to get round the problem: guitar and bass synth controllers. The actual synthesizer part is housed in this floor pedal unit here. It has 8 banks of memory capable of storing 64 sounds. And with ROM and RAM cartridges, you're able to add new presets or program your own. Once you've found a bass synth sound that you like, try playing it in a conventional context. By connecting to other synthesizers via MIDI, I'm able to access the sounds of this synth here, and also this synth module. In fact, in the next piece of music, I'll be using all 3 to give me the sound of Fender Rhodes, voice, and strings, while Alistair's going to take over the traditional role of bass. Don't expect to pick up one of these instruments and straight away start playing All Along the Watchtower with an orchestra patch. You have to take special care that your picking is clean and that the strings not in use are dampened. This is because the synth digitally processes every single string vibration, even those which would be inaudible in normal bass performance. If it doesn't hear a clean pitch, it makes a funny noise. With so many sounds at your disposal, technique and voicing become vitally crucial, and this can be a problem for bassists as well as guitarists. Here's Ultravox frontman Midge.
I found you had to change your playing technique. I'm such a sloppy player that when you come to do that on a guitar synth, because it's triggered, it's a pitch to voltage setup, so that when you hit a string on a guitar, you can dub a string on a guitar and pluck it or sort of scratch it, and nothing really comes out. You know, you're just messing about when you're playing. You don't hear those notes. You only hear the ones that you want. You can't do that on a guitar synth. You couldn't go. You can't do that because every note, every scratch, and every noise that you make on the strings comes out. So instead of getting this nice sort of, in theory, what should be a really nice string sound or plucked DX7 sound or something, playing a melody, it doesn't. What you hear is you know, all these horrible noises and they all come out at the same level. It's not like a guitar where you've got some form of expression there. They all sort of just belt out across the stage. So I had to limit myself to using it on stage only in 2 numbers, and I found it very difficult. I ended up having to play with my hand so clear from the strings that, you know, it looked as though I'd broken my arm or something. It was really strange.
Every guitar synth system has its good and bad points, but they are now becoming more sophisticated. With just a little bit of programming, you can now come up with interesting combinations of sound like this. You can also now buy units, like this one, which will convert any guitar into a synth controller. Now let's look at a different concept in MIDI conversion. The Synth-Axe. It's not quite like other guitars or even most other MIDI controllers. In fact, it's not a guitar. It doesn't produce any sound of its own. Its sole purpose is to produce MIDI information, which it does very well, and in this way. There are 2 sets of strings. This set of string takes care of pitch. When a string makes contact with a fret, it sends a signal to the computer inside saying what the pitch of the note is. This set of strings takes care of note on, note off, velocity and loudness parameters. However, you can press on left-hand trigger so that the fingerboard does all the triggering, like this. You don't even need to use the strings to trigger it. You can actually use these keys here, like this. Now, I should also mention that it's incredibly expensive, but these things all seem to come down in price eventually. Now here's a guitarist who's been very associated with the Synth-Axe in recent years, virtuoso guitarist Allan Holdsworth.
When this thing came along, it was just like I'd been waiting for it all my life, because it was an instrument that I understood because the notes are where they are on the guitar, so it will understand the language I've come to understand and translate it into one which will control synthesizers seriously.
Well, now with these guitar and bass synths, we've now got 3 synth players in the band, so let's look a bit at creating these sounds. We looked at analog synths in program 1, so what about digital synths? Well, FM is the most popular form of synthesis available today, and it comes in the form of these DX keyboards and various offshoots like the synth module that Henry's got in his setup. These synths have acquired a reputation for being hard to program, but with a little knowledge you could easily start altering factory sounds to suit yourself. Firstly, call up a sound, press Edit, and you'll notice that the display refers you to an algorithm number. Now, algorithms are groups of digital oscillators arranged in different combinations. And just to confuse you further, these oscillators are known as operators. Now, unlike analog synths, operators are set only to produce one waveform, that's a sine wave. And the way the DX generates complex waveforms is to call some operators carriers, the bottom row of numbers on your algorithm chart, and these form the basic pitch of the sound. The other operators are called modulators, and these jangle the frequency of the carriers and change the tonal quality of the sound. So, to hear the effect that each operator has got, try switching out different ones using the operator on-off button. 1 on the display means it's on and 0 means off. You'll notice that if I disable operator 1, here the sound disappears. This is because using this algorithm, operator 1 is the only carrier, and without it the sound doesn't exist. Now you could try experimenting with different algorithms. You'll find that if you're after a complex, harmonically rich sound, like the one we're using here, you'll need an algorithm with plenty of modulators in it, like this one. Or if you want a simple sound like an organ, you could choose an algorithm like this one, which is made up only of carriers. Well, this probably sounds very confusing, and it will be until you try experimenting. So, get to it.
Yes, you've guessed it, drummers have to program sounds too. And while guitar and bass synths may still be relatively rare, drum synths certainly are not. Following a short period of disbelief, electronic kits took off like wildfire. Now, some people still see them as a threat to or just a poor copy of acoustic drums, but what is undeniable is that electronics can offer the drummer a much greater variety of sounds, even to include tune sounds, as we discovered when we talked to ex-Yes and King Crimson drummer Bill Bruford.
My name's Bill. I do the rhythm. Don't talk to me about melody, harmony, don't want to know about that stuff. That's the keyboard player's department. I just do rhythm. Drummers previous to electronics had considered themselves just rhythm specialists, you know. I think that's becoming a fairly luxurious point of view, and I think drummers are increasingly interesting themselves in melody and harmony. And the new technology gives you control over those things. You can be a real musician. Sounds of an acoustic drum are enormously complex. What you get with electronic drums is something else entirely. The whole idea, it seemed to me, was that they should not be the same as acoustic drums, and in as much as the manufacturer kept trying to make them like acoustic drums, I'm not interested. I like them because they are a different instrument and require a different attitude from the drummer.
Now, as Bill says, electronic kits are different instruments from acoustic drums, and you may have to adapt your playing technique accordingly. These pads are simply rubberized surfaces, and as we've seen with the keyboard synthesizers before, they merely act as triggers, roughly conveying the force of the stroke to the drum synthesizer down here, which is the brain of the kit. The good news is you don't have to hit them so hard in order to be loud, and in fact, if you do, you can damage your wrists. But what is good about it is that some things are actually easier to play, like... what else? Well, they're light and they're compact, but then you need amplification. And of course, it has to be pretty hefty, otherwise you can end up splattering speaker cones all over the audience. A definite plus, though, is the complete sound separation of each pad, which makes live and recording mixing a lot easier. To sum up, I'd say the acoustic kit is unparalleled in that it's got an enormous dynamic and timbral range, which is only limited by the skill of you, the player, whereas the electronic kit excels in that you can have an enormous variety of sounds all programmed into one kit setup like this. Quick look at the sounds. Now, this kit has got both analog and digital sounds, and they're all programmable. So this snare drum, for instance, is purely a digital sample, but I can drastically alter it just by turning one parameter down here. Tom 1 is totally analog. Tom 2, a mixture of analog and digital with some click and noise thrown in. Tom 3 is weird. And this is only the beginning. This kit, in fact, is connected to this MIDI junction box, which does effects and sequences, which is in turn MIDI'd to the tune percussion synthesizer down here, so that I can get all sorts of tunes and sequences and echo effects like this. But for the complete works, back to Bill Bruford.
I am playing a Simmons SDS9, which is a basic drum setup here, which is MIDI'd to this guy here, which is an outboard synthesizer, allowing me to produce a lot of the pitches and sounds that you hear. I'm also playing a Simmons SDS7 here, which provides 12 channels worth of interesting sound. The whole lot is wired into this genius little thing here called the MTM, which is a sort of elaborate routing device. And then that talks to, it sends messages to all the units to turn up with certain programs at certain times. This unit here will allow me to store 100 odd programs of anything I like, any combination of any of these instruments, with or without drum sounds, with or without certain pads. Any pad can be any sound at any time, in any combination, all storable in here where it says play patch. Now it says I'm going to play patch 17. For the purposes of this demonstration, we'll just see what is on 17. As you can tell, there's actually no drum sound there at all. But there are two notes, dual layer it's called. You can see as I play it harder, in come the pitches. Patch 20 is aha, an old favorite where the snare drum is now routed to this thing, which used to be the bass drum. And the bass drum is routed up to where the snare drum is. So you can suddenly do 5-stroke rolls on your bass drum and sound great. So don't worry about that double bass drum technique. You can just route it up there to the snare drum and play that. I think the next patch probably is the same thing but in reverse, so that the snare drum is where the snare drum usually is. So cycling between the two. Of course, the pads are all velocity sensitive, which means that the information that is being transmitted through MIDI will change quite radically depending on the strength of the stroke. Just some pitches that... You can hear the other overtones coming in from the drum, and you can also hear the other pitches in the chord that has been stored in the MTM's brain coming in as I play hard, and more notes of the chord come in until the full chord is sounded. All good fun. So where had I got to? Oh, yes. More complex sound altogether. Now the MTM is allowing me to add various echoes and delays to each pad differently. I've also instructed the MTM to shift pitches on certain pads. As you can tell, with the one stroke, it's sending a semitone up to the pad so that I can get that particular effect. There we have just one drum sound and the synthesizer pitch. There we have a different kind of delay or repeat. There we have a very complex sound where the drum is rising up and the pitches are descending down chromatically, stepped down in ones.
Good grief, well now we've got 4 synth players in the band. Well, just to add to the confusion, the keyboards I play aren't necessarily the ones that make the noise. This is because with MIDI I can choose whichever keyboard I want to use as my controller, which is why I'm often playing different synth parts from this keyboard here, the digital piano, as it's got a comfortable weighted action and wooden keys, and is also very expressive. Although if you're into 200-mile-an-hour synth solos, you can't beat a standard synth action. So for any particular number, I might have 2 keyboards and maybe the sequencer controlling several other synths. So I might spend the rest of my life disconnecting and connecting MIDI leads if it wasn't for this programmable MIDI patch bay. What I do is I take the MIDI ins and outs and plug them all into this box here, and then use the remote control to recall up to 32 different routings. And if I'm feeling particularly clever, I could get it to change all the synth programs automatically. Wonderful. I'll have 3. Now, with keyboards, you'll mostly find that you play in a MIDI mode called Omni-On Poly, where your synth will respond to all 16 MIDI channels, just like your radio is capable of tuning into many different stations. Now, if you had a radio which was capable of receiving only one station, this would be the equivalent of Omni-Off Poly, whereby your synth will respond only to one channel. This is important for sequencers, especially when playing multiple parts on different synths, as you might want, say, one synth playing a bass part on channel 1 and a rhythm part being played by another synth on channel 2 and so on.
A mode often used on guitar synthesizer is Omni-Off Mono. This means you can send a signal from each string on 6 different MIDI channels. Now this is handy for, say, splitting the strings into 2 groups and using each group to control a separate synthesizer with its own separate sound.
If you're new to synthesizers the same as I am, it's not that difficult to get started. For example, simply by MIDIing up the octapads to a synthesizer and by dialing up the 8 correct MIDI note numbers to correspond to the 8 notes that I want to play, I can jam along with the rest of them. In fact, in this last masterpiece, I'm going to be playing mostly piano and Al's going to be playing mostly drums.